US support for Israel began in 1947 following the UN resolution to recognize the State of Israel. Then President Harry S. Truman was the pivotal piece upon which US support for Israel rested. In November 1953, after his presidency, Harry went to be celebrated at the Jewish Theological Seminary, when his old friend Eddie Jacobson introduced him as the man who helped create the State of Israel. Truman responded, "What do you mean helped to create? I am Cyrus." Truman here made reference to the Persian king who overthrew the Babylonians in 593 BC and helped the Jews who had been held captive in Babylon return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. On November 28, 1947, on the eve of the UN vote, the CIA presented to Truman a document titled "The Consequences of the Partition of Palestine." From this document, the goodwill enjoyed by the US at the time of the Roosevelt-Ibn Saud Conference, and following the backing of Lebanese and Syrian claims for independence, was short-lived as a result of President Truman's support for Jewish immigration to Palestine and of the Anglo-American Committee report. Because of the long-standing cultural ties between the US and the Arab world, the friendly role that the US has played in the achievement of Syrian and Lebanese independence, the partial dependence of certain Arab states on oil royalties from US companies, and the promise of increased royalties in the future, the Arab states would like to maintain friendly relations with the US. Little of this development will be possible if the US supports a Jewish state in Palestine. The CIA in 1947 knew very well that supporting Israel would ruin the positive relationship America had with Arab nations in the Middle East. This was echoed by the State Department's Director for Near Eastern and African Affairs, Loy Henderson, who later recalled how American diplomats were taking into account the sensitivities of Arab nations at the time. In an oral history interview with Harry S. Truman Library, Henderson said that when he was the ambassador to Iraq in the mid-1940s, top Iraqi government officials told him, if the United States should decide to take a firm stand in establishing a Zionist state in Palestine, the whole Arab world would begin to feel that the United States had become an enemy of the Arabs, and that the Middle East would become anti-American. The Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry that would recommend solutions to the refugee crisis faced by Jews after the Second World War and the future of Palestine presented its reporting in the spring of 1946, which called on Britain to permit 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine. This report also opposed either an Arab or Jewish state. This of course infuriated Zionists, who successfully lobbied Truman to withhold his endorsement of the plan, but Truman, who favored the idea, later sent a State Department official, Henry Grady, to Britain to devise with the British representative Herbert Morrison a specific plan for Palestine's future. Instead of a Jewish or Arab state, it was proposed that the state be run on a United Nations trusteeship, administered by what was presumably going to be Britain, since Palestine was already a protectorate of Britain since after World War I, where British interjected their support for the region in preparation for the Balfour Declaration of 1917, where it was promised that Palestine would become a national home for the Jewish people. This promise was presented to the Rothschild family's Lionel Walter Rothschild, who was a part of the very wealthy and powerful banking dynasty who played a large role in the founding of Israel. The British promise of Palestine for the Jews, which now had come to fruition with the support of Truman, was of course the beginning of the decline of the US and Arab relationship. Both the CIA and State Department had made this abundantly clear that they knew this was going to be the case. During this time, Secretary of State George Marshall and Secretary of Defense James Forrestal worked not only against the idea of the Israeli Jewish state, but also to counter the migration of Jews from Europe to Palestine.
Jews round up from home and abroad. We start in the harbour at Haifa, among still more shiploads of illegal Jewish immigrants seeking homes in Palestine. Closely guarded, bringing their children with them, they are searched for arms and sprayed as a precaution against typhus-carrying lice. More tinder for the Palestine powder keg, these Jews are now being sent to Cyprus to await international decisions on disputed Palestine.
An angry Marshall wrote in a May 12, 1948 memo after a contentious meeting on the issue with Truman, Clifford, and other officials, "I said bluntly that if the president were to follow Mr. Clifford's advice, and if in the elections I were to vote, I would vote against the president. Truman considered George to be the greatest American alive at the time and valued his advice more than anyone else's, so for Truman to go against George's recommendations is telling of the pressure he was under." That pressure came in the form of threats against both Truman's career and life. Harry was subjected to intense Zionist lobbying. A senior member of the State Department described a 1946 visit to New York when a group of Jews called upon Truman. Alan Taylor writes, "Emanuel Seller was the head of this committee. Rabbi Stephen Wise and several others were in it. They called upon Mr. Truman and said, "We have just been talking with Mr. Thomas Dewey, and he is willing to come out and declare for a Jewish state, and we are going to turn our money and urge the Jews to vote for him unless you beat him to it." Then Emanuel Seller pounded upon Mr. Truman's desk and said, "And if you don't come out for a Jewish state, we'll run you out of town." Rabbi Dr. Abba Hillel Silver was the co-leader of the American Zionist movement in the 1940s, along with Rabbi Stephen S. Wise. This movement represented what was known at the time as the American Zionist Emergency Council, or AZEC. Rabbi Silver mobilized Zionist activists nationwide, Christians as well as Jews, to take part in a massive campaign of rallies, lobbying, petitions, and other protests urging President Truman to support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Truman deeply resented the pressure, and since Silver was its primary instigator, the president disliked him intensely. In one handwritten note to an aide in 1946, Truman blamed terror and Silver as the cause of some, if not all, of our troubles. By terror, he was referring to the Jewish underground militias that were committing terror attacks on British and Arab targets in Palestine.
The King David Hotel itself. It was in the wing on the right of the picture that the terrorists placed their explosive. And the result of the crime, the tragic scene, is like a serious incident during the Blitz. The hotel housed the British Army headquarters and the Palestine government offices, and casualties were very heavy. 65 deaths are reported, and there is little or no hope of survival for any of the 58 missing. Nearly 50 others were injured. The Jewish terrorist organization, Irgun Tzvai Leumi, openly admitted responsibility for the bombing.
The goal of attacking British in Palestine was to remove their presence, as they acted as mediators over the conflicts ensuing from Jewish land grabs, and tried being more fair to the Palestinians than was acceptable to the IZL and, more importantly, the Stern Gang, who represented the Zionist forces who were willing to commit terror attacks on Western nations and their leaders. British presence in their view was treated as a colonialist imposition, impeding the Zionist project.
Meantime, the roundup of terrorist killers goes on. Manacled ex-lieutenants of dead gangster Abraham Stern, these men face murder charges after attacks on British workshops in Haifa. 18 Stern Gang members have been condemned to death. Among the captured were 4 women. Supporting a wounded companion, they go for trial. Often placed in the front ranks of rioting mobs, terrorist women are a new provocation to British troops.
In the midst of a July 30th, 1946 cabinet discussion about the American Jewish dissatisfaction over his Palestine policy, Truman exploded, holding up a stack of telegrams which, according to Secretary of Commerce Henry Williams, was 4 inches thick, and, in reference to the Jewish lobby, stated, "Jesus Christ couldn't please them when he was here on earth, so how could anyone expect that I would have any luck?" What was this dissatisfaction over, you might wonder? Truman conferred regularly with Henry Grady, and in late July approved what was called the Morrison-Grady Plan. It would establish a federated Palestine with autonomous Jewish and Arab regions. The British, or whoever the United Nations appointed, would retain control of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Negev until the Arabs and Jews, who would enjoy equal representation in a national legislature, were ready to rule all of Palestine without going to war with each other. Truman and the State Department were eager to publicly endorse the plan, but Silver and the Zionist lobby mounted a furious campaign against the proposal. Zionists wanted their Israel, and deeply resented the British and American attempts to be fair to the Arabs.
1549.
But don't think that decision to recognize Israel is an easy one. I had to make a compromise with the Arabs and divide Palestine. The Jews wanted to chase all the Arabs into the Tigris and Euphrates River, and the Arabs wanted to chase all the Jews into the Red Sea. And what I was trying to do was to find a homeland for the Jews and still be just with the Arabs. But when you go into a thing of that kind, the people you help most are the ones that get most angry with you. Both of them were against me on the situation, but as President of the United States, I paid no attention to them, carried out what I thought was right, and I had the support of the Congress, and I could do it, which is unusual in these days.
Could you tell us specifically that a lot of Jewish people were against you too?
Oh, well, there were a lot of Jewish people against me because they wanted the whole of Palestine. As I say, they wanted to drive all the Arabs into the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Yeah.
The response to Truman's wavering support over the killing of Palestinians and British, along with the denial of the Zionist plan to clear Palestinians out of the area that would become Israel, was met with vitriol and threats of career destruction from the Jewish lobby in the US and assassination attempts from the Jewish militias in Israel. Harry S. Truman's autobiography was written and finished shortly before his death by his daughter Margaret Truman. She writes the following about the attempts on her father's life. In the summer of 1947, the so-called Stern Gang of Palestine terrorists tried to assassinate Dad by mail. A number of cream-colored envelopes, about 8 by 6 inches, arrived in the White House, addressed to the President and various members of the staff. Inside them was a smaller envelope, marked private and confidential. Inside the second envelope was powdered gelignite, a pencil battery, and a detonator rigged to explode the gelignite when the envelope was opened. Fortunately, the White House mailroom was alert to the possibility that such letters might arrive. The previous June, at least 8 were sent to British government officials, including Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. The British police exploded one of these experimentally and said it could kill, or at the very least maim, anyone unlucky enough to open it. The mailroom turned the letters over to the Secret Service, and they were defused by their bomb experts. The Secret Service still screens all of our mail. Harry's personal diaries reveal further opinions on those he had dealings with over the creation of Israel, which were very unflattering. Truman wrote in July 1947 in his personal diaries, 10 months before David Ben-Gurion declared Israel's independence, "The Jews, I find, are very, very selfish. They care not how many Estonians, Latvians, Finns, Poles, Yugoslavs, or Greeks get murdered or mistreated as displaced persons as long as the Jews get special treatment. When they have power, physical, financial, or political, neither Hitler nor Stalin has anything on them for cruelty or mistreatment to the underdog." Despite this, Harry is still celebrated by Zionist organizations today, but after the Morrison-Grady plan, which had sought to create a single-state solution, had fallen through in 1946, Harry didn't really do much to actively support Israel, leaving the decisions about Israel to the State Department. The State Department at the time was far more opposed to Israel than Truman, as I've previously discussed, and naturally the whole scenario Truman had faced around 1946 found itself recurring as the 1948 election loomed. Truman and the Democrats had to worry not just about the Jewish vote, but also about fundraising from wealthy Jewish contributors. And they had to worry too, not just about the Republican opponent, but about Progressive Party candidate Henry Wallace, who charged a vote for Truman was a vote to rebuild Nazi Germany. Truman's withdrawal from the issue of Israel was a resentful one, writing to a Democratic National Committee official that the situation, that being Israel, is insoluble in my opinion. He wanted nothing more at this point in his career to move on from the hostilities and threats sent his direction, knowing he could not get his way without the powerful Jewish lobby in the US coming out against his election bid. Following his re-election in 1948, Truman made the announcement in a brief 2-sentence statement. "This government has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine, and recognition has been requested by the provincial government thereof. The United States recognizes the provincial government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel." This was regarded the moment when truly the US began to support Israel, but it is important to note that this support was only so much as a show of approval. Truman still maintained the arms embargo on Israel, not wanting to provide the armaments required of the Israeli state. Instead, Israel continued as they had been doing prior, and was covered in the former mentioned CIA document, the Partition of Palestine, relying on armament from the USSR. The support of the Eastern European Communist bloc for Israel was so profound that without it, Israel would not exist. From the Haaretz article, The Communists Who Saved the Jewish State by Aryeh Dayan, David Ben-Gurion once stated that thanks to this assistance from communist Czechoslovakia, which also included the famous Czech rifles as well as 10 fighter planes, the IDF was able to win the war. As part of the deal signed in January 1948, Czechoslovakia supplied some 50,000 rifles, 6,000 machine guns, and around 90 million bullets. But the most important contracts were signed in late April and early May of 1948. They promised to supply 25 fighter planes and arranged for the training on Czech soil and in Czech military facilities of Israeli pilots and technicians who would fly and maintain them. The planes, which were disassembled and flown to Israel on large transport planes, after their reassembly played a very important role in halting the Egypt Army's advance south of Ashdod. The assistance of the Air Force continued to flow in during the second half of 1948, when it consisted of 56 Spitfire fighter planes. Communism had no reason to highlight this episode of history, but anyone looking into it will immediately discover that Czechoslovakia provided the assistance to Israel in the name of the Soviet Union, and under its instruction. In Israel too, the episode caused political discomfort. Israeli administrations were uncomfortable recalling the fact that the weapons that saved the IDF in 1948 actually came from the communist bloc, and it was even more uncomfortable to acknowledge that the appeal to the communist bloc came as a result of the arms embargo of the United States imposed on Israel. The Soviet Union had hoped that its support of Israel would turn Israel into a pro-Soviet state, but after January 1949, after the elections for the first Knesset, which David Ben-Gurion's Mapai won, and the pro-Soviet parties lost, the Czechoslovakian assistance stopped immediately, and the Jewish socialists instead turned to America for support, since unlike in the USSR they had a powerful lobby there. 1948 was the year that Britain then ended its mandate over Palestine. The British terminated the mandate at midnight at the end of the 14th of May 1948, ending the Protectorate of Palestine. British troops and personnel had that day departed from the city of Haifa, and the Jewish leadership of what was known as the Yishuv, meaning the settlement in Hebrew, declared the establishment of the State of Israel. This escalated the already ongoing civil war, which was characterized by the guerrilla warfare between Arabs and Jews, which had been occurring since the UN voted to adopt the Partition of Palestine plan on 30th of November 1947, which sought to create both an Arab and a Jewish state. Naturally, Arabs opposed this, whilst Jews were in favor of it. The infamous Nakba, or expulsion of Palestinians from their ancestral homes, that ultimately saw some 700,000 both expelled and forced to flee, began after that UN resolution in 1947, and continued throughout the 1948 war, known to the Arabs as the Palestine War and the Jews as the War of Independence. After the British left, clear lines were drawn and major conflict ensued. Harry Truman had failed in his attempts to be fair to both Arabs and Jews, and the State Department and the US intelligence failed to stop the founding of Israel. The US Zionist lobby had gotten what they wanted, a Jewish state. The relationship between the US and the Arab world was destroyed, and none of this would have been possible without the support Israel received from the USSR.